It is my honor to welcome Dr. Beazer at the Jordan Centers, and I hope we all will have a wonderful time today. Dr. Quintin Beazer is an associate professor of political science at Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida. He's also an associate fellow at International Center for the Study of Institutions and Development at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Dr. Beazer studies comparative and international political economy and authoritarian politics with specialization in the politics of Russia and other post-communist countries. His research examines how politics and economics interact in messy environments where institutions are weak, in transition, or non-democratic. And his research has been published in the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and the International Studies Quarterly. Today, Dr. Beazer is going to present his research on the demand for local elections in Russia. So the floor is yours. Welcome, Dr. Beazer.
Thank you, Nastya, and thank you to the Jordan Center for having me out. I'm grateful to be a part of the program today, so thank you to those of you who are here in person and those who are joining us online. So this is co-authored work with Noah Buckley and John Reuter, and this follows on a number of projects that we've sort of worked together on, we worked on together as well as worked on separately, and I'm excited to share with you some of this research today. So as we get started, so if you've been following the news in Russia, this was perhaps the big electoral news that you were focused in on in the last 2 weeks, right? That recently we had presidential elections in Russia. Leading up to it, people expected a certain outcome, and guess what? We got that outcome, right? As we look to sort of see how did this pan out, it panned out exactly like we thought it was going to pan out. So Putin was elected for, I guess, his 4th term in office with a resounding, result, 87%. That's sort of up in the territory of Central Asian dictatorship kind of support. So this is perhaps for the Kremlin, this is seen as a win. For many people, including perhaps many Russians, looking at this is sort of seen as this is exactly what we expected, right? Nothing new here. Now, perhaps the electoral news that you did not see in the last 2 weeks was something that happened just today, but we heard about it a couple of days ago. So this is from the newspaper Baikal Daily, and in the Republic of Buryatia, the regional capital Ulan-Ude is losing its ability to elect mayors. So up until this point, the people of Ulan-Ude could elect mayors through electoral processes that seem very normal and familiar to us. But as of, about 8 hours ago today, the city council voted to change the city charter in order to remove the ability to elect mayors directly, and now mayors will be appointed through a system that includes sort of a proposal from the special commission comprised of the city council and the regional legislature. There'll be a slate of candidates, and then the city council will choose from among those slate of candidates. So on one hand, we have presidential elections that are garnering a lot of attention, but the outcomes of which we think are foreordained. And on the other hand, we have these local elections, which in the past have been centers of contestation and competition, and those are going away. And our project here, and somewhat sort of the flavor of the projects we've pursued in the past, is really getting at this question. Of what value are elections to people living under autocracy? We have, by far and away, the modal kind of authoritarian regime we observe in the world today is what we call electoral authoritarian regimes. These are political regimes in which there are elections held on regular cycles. Various people are allowed to stand or parties are allowed to compete, but we don't believe that those electoral contestations are free and fair, that they don't provide a sense of, they don't provide real competition or a sense of sort of unpredictability about who's going to win, or that unpredictability is sort of really muted, right? So the question is, what good are these elections to people who live there, and do they value them? Do they think that they are worth keeping? And so anecdotally, it seems like the answer is yes. At least in Russia, in this same presidential election, we observe a number of people who do not support the regime still turning out for elections in sort of this opposition proposed scheme to come to the polling precincts at noon. on the last day of voting. So this is a thing that was proposed by Navalny before he died, and the opposition sort of groups sort of supported this, said, you know, if you are against Putin, so Noon Against Putin was the name of the protest, and we see sort of across many Russian cities, large amounts of turnout at the precincts at this noon time. So it's both a demonstration of people who value the electoral process, although they might not value the people who are likely to sort of benefit from this electoral process. Right? So anecdotally, we think, yes, we can observe that at least in Russia, even in March 2024, there are people who think these elections ought to mean something, and they want to participate even if they're not particularly excited or enthused about the way they're being carried out. Right? More systematically, if we look at research in social science and political science, we see that there's lots of survey evidence that suggests that people living in electoral authoritarian regimes do see these things, that they want to continue to have these things, right? So if we look at survey work from 2011 from Henry Hale, you know, the Russian election survey, 96% of voters think yes. 96% of respondents think voters should choose the leaders. There should be this process where they get to vote and have input. The top citation here, this is data from the Afrobarometer, which is a survey that's conducted across a number of countries in Africa. And we see a similar thing, similar responses to electoral authoritarian regimes in Africa, that large groups of people, so 76% people think that we should hold elections, they should be honest, free, and fair. Right? So this is a thing that's even folks who are living under these regimes see this elections as a desirable thing if they're being done in the right way. And we have evidence from a number of studies that suggest when things are being done in the electoral process that suggest fraud or manipulation, that voters and citizens express disappointment, disgust, revulsion, anger, these kind of various responses. So here's work by my co-author John Reuter and David Zacconi from a survey experiment in Russia, where they give some people a hypothetical scenario to read about a particular candidate from United Russia that in one circumstance, they're told engaged in sort of electoral shenanigans in ways that would have sort of undermined the integrity of the system. Other people assigned at random to a different scenario where they read about this candidate from United Russia who participated in a way that is characterized as sort of free and fair and above board. And we see that, you know, across these two groups, the people who read about the candidate from United Russia express much more disappointment. They're less supportive of this candidate. And that's particularly strong for people who are already supporters of United Russia. They seem to be disappointed that their candidate is involved in something that looks like electoral malfeasance. Right? Same thing if we look here, this work by Milan Svolik in Turkey. We can look during this is research from mayoral elections in Istanbul, and it's a similar kind of story with survey experiments embedded in surveys, and show that voters, when they're told that the candidate standing may have engaged in sort of something that looks like electoral malpractice, they're less supportive. They're more likely to want to, you know, redo the election or support sort of measures to prevent that in the future. So it looks like people, when confronted with sort of evidence or suggestion that leaders are engaged in activity that is degrading the value of these elections, they're disappointed in that too, right? And again, like anecdotally, we don't even, like, we have evidence of this from Russia. So here's the pictures from the 2011-2012 electoral cycle, where there was widespread reports of fraud, both in the legislative elections and then later in the presidential elections. And people responded pretty strongly and negatively to this. Right. So theoretically, what is it that people might like about elections, even if they're living in an autocratic regime? Right? Now, some of the reasons they may support it are on normative grounds, that in and of themselves, people feel like elections have some sort of intrinsic value. And that may be because they're allowed to express themselves. They live in a system that maybe doesn't often give them a chance to participate. And even though this is maybe a constrained and sort of degraded version of participation, it's still a way to participate and express their support or their disagreement, their opposition. And sometimes this is just because this is a fundamental right. This is what the Constitution says I should be able to do. I want to exercise that right. Right? Aside from those sort of normative, expressive kind of concerns, some people might support elections, even if they don't think that's great. They might think this process still gives me something that's valuable. So it could be instrumental in the material gains they get from it. If people have to stand for election and compete with someone else, even if it's not a very sort of rigorous competition, they may be more likely to respond to concerns of citizens, at least during election time, right? So you might get more responsive government, or you might get more representative government, even if it's not sort of responsive and representative in the same scale as it would be if it was a very competitive democratic election. We still might get something better than we get if we don't have the election at all. To the extent that sort of election gives a chance to sort of kick out bad leaders or give the party a chance to put someone else up for the role, this may be an opportunity to get rid of leaders who are performing poorly, right? And just the logic of sort of electoral mechanisms, even if it's not a very competitive electoral environment, might still generate incentives for politicians to sort of care more about things like economic growth or public service provision, things that voters want, even if they're not as attentive as they might be in a more democratic scenario. They're, it's likely they're more responsive than the counterfactual of when there's no election at all. Right? And we're going to have some information. We're going to have at the very end of the talk, I can share some data on this part. But let's not oversell sort of how good these elections are. Right? When we look at that 87% of Vladimir Putin in the presidential election, like none of us think this is an electoral process that was working as it should, and that this candidate is someone who was really interested in being more responsive to people at this particular time, right? So, there's plenty of reason to think that people who live in these electoral environments might think that this is a farce and that we don't need to continue with that farce, right? And so, some people might see these elections as being sort of, they're not very meaningful, or I'm not offered really a wide range of choices that are meaningful choices, or even if there are meaningful choices to make, I'm not being allowed to make them in a way that's going to lead to the results I want. And sort of these are going to be manipulated, or they're going to engage in fraud in a way that they're not useful, right? So this citation up in the corner is actually that same citation to the survey response where 76% of people said yes, we should have free and fair and honest elections. The headline of that article is support for elections weakens among Africans. Many see them as ineffective in holding leaders accountable, right? So that 76% represents a drop from what it was before. And in the survey evidence, it looks like it's because people think that these elections don't allow them to actually hold leaders accountable. So there are some people who may abandon support for elections in these environments because they think it's a sham, it's not going to let me hold them accountable, let's just sort of not go through with that, right? And if you look at the Russian experience, you might understand why people could feel that way in this situation. So that same 2011 election cycle we were talking about earlier, right? Here's just a little splashy visual from the Wall Street Journal looking at some electoral forensic evidence of fraud that took place in that election, right? That if we look at turnout for United Russia, that's the red here in the upper left, we see that in precincts where they had 100% turnout, almost all of those precincts those votes went to United Russia. Whereas if we look at turnout for other parties, we see a very kind of different looking distribution. Here on the right, these dark red spikes at round numbers like 70 and 75. These are sort of, people looked at these results and said, this looks like a distribution of votes that is the product of officials turning in set numbers of results rather than counting results that turn in. So they were given quotas. Your precinct needs to turn in 70% of the votes for United Russia, party of power. And what do you get? You get a result where the precinct turns over a certain number of votes regardless of what the actual results were. So, if people look at this and have this experience, they might think, what good are these elections, right? Similarly, here's a little anecdote from Primorsky Krai, so the far eastern region of Russia in 2018. The United Russia candidate, Andrei Tarasenko, was losing badly as the results started to come in. And then in the last hour of counting, all of a sudden, his results shot up, giving him enough to miraculously overcome this large deficit where he was trailing the other candidate and win. And this was so bad and so flagrant that actually they had to redo the election because the electoral commission invalidated this and said, there's something wrong there. Redo the election. And of course, when you get to redo it again, you can get the right result. They can prepare more on time, right? So this might be a reason why people wouldn't support, is they think these electoral competitions are manipulated or constrained in a way that make them unuseful. But even if you believe that the electoral process isn't being manipulated, you could be still in this environment and think elections might not be the thing we want, right? There are Russians who lived through the 90s and remember the chaotic days of democracy during that time period might remember some elections that were characterized by sort of what they called black politics, and they had local political machines that were organizing voters, putting pressure on voters, or rigging results in their own ways. So they might believe that sort of these kind of elections just lead to sort of dirty politics in a way they find sort of offensive. Some people, for many people, their main concern is just getting through the day, and electoral competitions are just low salience. They think that's somebody else's problem. I don't need to worry about it. I need to worry about how to sort of feed my family and improve my material living conditions. And then this last point, I want to just, in an era of intense polarization, it's quite possible that some people who would otherwise support elections may remove their support for elections when it looks like the wrong kind of people, when out partisans, people who support the wrong candidate, the wrong party, look like they're going to win. Well, maybe we might be better off if we just remove their chance to win. And so this paper from Milan Swolik shows that this exact thing in Venezuela, where voters who find out that support might be turning for the opposition candidate as opposed to the incumbent Maduro, if they're Maduro supporters, they look more willing to do things that look anti-democratic and sort of remove the opportunity to elect people. Right? So let's get back to this local election, because this is actually, so we've been talking kind of big electoral kind of environment, but really this paper is about this Ulan-Ude kind of experience where we have local elections at the city level for mayors, where people can directly elect the chief executive for their city, and that opportunity disappears. Like, do people care? Is this a thing that is going to, that they will miss? And more specifically, if they care and if they miss it, is it a thing that then feeds back into the way they feel about the regime and they feel about the leader of that regime, Putin? And so this is the research question for our project, is how does removing these local elections, the opportunity to vote for mayors, affect how people feel about the regime? So if this is news to you, Ulan-Ude is not a unique experience. As a matter of fact, Ulan-Ude is maybe unique in the sense that it still has elections in 2024, or had elections up until today, right? The most Russian cities have lost this opportunity to elect direct mayors over the last decade and a half. That starting in the beginning of the century, in the year 2000, about 90% of Russian cities had city charters that allowed them to vote for mayors. So that's the chief executive model that they had, with a directly elected mayor. And over the course of the 2000s, and then taking a dramatic jump up after 2014, for reasons I'll tell you in a minute, we see that most large Russian cities lost that opportunity. So direct elections for mayors were abolished. So what we have now is a system in which,
can you just say just a tiny little bit of background about like who has the legal authority?
Yeah, there's a slide for that coming in a second.
Okay,
yeah,
right.
So I'll tell you.
So when you say we're abolished, I want to know.
So
that sentence
so the question to people online, if they couldn't hear Josh, was that sort of how does this happen? And I'll tell you in just 1 second, but at least I'll let you know it's happened pretty much everywhere at this point. And of the 80 some odd regions in Russia, only 4 today remain with a regional capital that has direct.
But who has the legal authority to change the elections?
So the direct.
This is different than gubernatorial elections. Right?
This is different than gubernatorial elections. So here's the slide. Let's talk through this. So what happens is this is something that the city council eventually has to sign off on. But in most cases, it's a thing that starts at the region level with the governor putting pressure on the city, or the regional mayor who is already a member of the United Russia getting pressure from within the party to change this. And so there's at some level, there's this proposal that's floated within the city council to change the city charter. So this part of the electoral law is embedded in the city charter of all these Russian cities. And so to change that, there's the legal process involves the city council. So there's a proposal, and then there's this draft amendment that's written. And so there's a vote within the city council on this, and then it goes to a period of public commentary. And this is announced publicly, and they have like 2 or 3 weeks, and there's usually some meeting where anyone in the public, in theory, is allowed to come talk. In many cases, people are actually shut out and prevented from getting in there, or they change the time, lock the doors, or turn off the microphones on people. But there are moments
And is there like a population threshold on this rule, or is this the smallest towns can do this? The
Yeah,
largest cities, it doesn't, it's all the same.
It's all the same procedure, well, as long as they have a city charter, right, so they can be of various population sizes.
Okay.
But the data that we're gonna be looking at in a minute are all from the largest cities in Russia, like the 200 largest cities, so these are populations of like 400,000 and above, something like that. But this same process applies to cities, 40,000 to 400,000, something like that. I'm not sure about like at the small village level what self-governance looks like there, but municipalities above a certain tens of thousands of population, this is the process. And so there's the public commentary period, and then after the public commentary period, the city council goes back to vote on this again, and depends on the city rules, but usually there's 3 readings of a bill, so they'll go through another 2 or 3 rounds, and these are often pro forma. And then after it's been adopted with the final reading, there's a change to the city charter. So as we were creating our data set, we read through hundreds of these city charters, and so there was this weird moment in time about 2 or 3 years ago where I was like kind of qualified to be a Russian paralegal in a very specific way. If you wanted to know about like Ustavy at the local level, I could tell you where to find the parts that you're interested in, because I had read lots of them. Not as good anymore. So this process was how it happened up until 2014, and then in 2014 a new wrinkle gets added, and that is that the federal law on self-governance for municipalities gets amended to allow regional legislatures to initiate this process. So before, this was a process that, despite the governor sort of often leaning on cities to do it, the governor didn't have any technical sort of ability to do this. Now the law changes, so the regional authorities, the regional legislature, I guess, legally can pass laws that say, cities, all the cities in our region, or specific cities in our region, or cities of above a certain size in our region, now have to transition to this different model of self-governance that involves an appointed executive as opposed to an elected executive, right? And so this happens, the federal legislation passes in early 2014, and then we see this sort of big wave through the early parts of 2015, where a number of regional legislatures, are instructed to use this tool essentially, and use it to force a number of the cities that had not yet transitioned into this process. So I'll give you one dramatic example, and this is from the Oblast of Kemerovo. And here we have 2 big cities. So on the left, we have the mayor of the city of Kemerovo, and on the right, we have the mayor of the city of Novokuznetsk. These are 2 large cities, kind of, I don't know if hotbeds of independent opposition activity is the right way to describe it, but certainly not sort of strongholds of United Russia, the party of power. So neither of these mayors were members of United Russia, independent and really popular. And up until this point, although the region had gained the opportunity, the authority to force these cities to transition, it had been a really unpopular idea, so they'd held off. But in January of 2019, actually, I guess the first week of February of 2019, a news story breaks that it turns out the week before, the regional legislature had passed a law removing direct elections in both of these cities, and the deputies who had signed it hadn't even known it was in the bill, that it got sandwiched in between a number of things, snuck in there in sort of language that was sort of not immediately obvious. But it turns out, they signed a bill, and then they actually didn't find out until journalists turned around and said, "Do you realize what you just did?" And they said, "Oh my goodness, no." Oh well, right? And so the bill was already passed without any kind of, without these cities or some of the politicians who signed it even knowing. So in this case, just because we're talking about the legal technicalities here, when the regional government would sign a law saying these local municipalities had to change their level of, their method of governance, this still has to be adopted into the city charter. So the cities underneath them still have to go through their process, even though there's a regional law saying, you have to do this or else you're in violation of the law. They still go through this process of then voting, public commentary, and changing the city charter. So what has the response been like to this? Well, sort of just kind of in a haphazard way, it looks like the result, the response has been pretty negative. That if we look from the time these reforms started in the early 2000s up until very recently, consistently a majority of survey respondents say, we don't like this. We want to be able to, we prefer direct elections for our mayors. You know, we think that sort of this is the model that's going to do it best. If you ask them sort of what they think the results are going to be, they think we'll be better off with elected mayors as opposed to appointed mayors consistently over sort of almost a 20-year period now. When you ask people what they want is to be able to elect their own mayors. So, for example, sort of here, that's kind of just across Russia. If we look within the cities at the time these proposals are on the docket, we see that the same sort of story, that this is not a popular move. So in Perm, we see this sort of graffiti on the ground that says 75% of people in Perm want to be able to elect their mayor. In Arkhangelsk, they have a survey that goes out at the same time. And so like, yep, people know this is happening. They're unhappy with it, and they think it's going to be bad for the city. But nonetheless, these reforms get pushed through. And we see as they get pushed through, there's often some kinds of pushback, right? So we have a number of cities across Russia, and here's two examples, where the first time the United Russia tries to get deputies in the city council to push this through, they actually fail. Right? Matter of fact, in Ryazovsk, they fail 4 times before they're successful. And it takes them a number of times to sort of, they don't control the city council, they don't control the majority of the seats in the city council. Often sort of, this isn't a thing that gets through. It's really a policy proposal that only gets through once United Russia is able to control the majority of seats in the city council. And even when we have like after 2014, when the regional legislature can impose this upon cities, we see that this part of the process that the cities need to participate in, they drag their feet for a long time. So Novokuznetsk, one of those cities in Kemerovo, where it was sprung upon them in a sort of a sneak attack, the city doesn't actually ratify this for almost a year. The city council drags, they have the regional prosecutor comes in and says, people who won't vote for this are at risk of not being able to stand for office and being thrown in jail. So it's like, you're violating the law. And nonetheless, they sort of held off for a long time before giving in, right? And then sometimes we see protests. This isn't the dominant outcome, but sometimes we do in fact see protests. So the picture here is from Yekaterinburg in 2018, when the people of the city lost their ability to elect their mayor. But many cities before, and it quizzically, sort of the last city on this list, Irkutsk, actually they lost their elections. They lost the ability to elect their mayor. Sorry, just for terminology, I say lost elections, canceled elections, removed elections, abolished elections. It's all the same thing. We're talking about once there was a mechanism for them to elect a mayor, and now there's no longer a mechanism for them to elect a mayor.
So when the elections are removed, so is the mayor then appointed by the city council?
So the question here is once they can't elect a mayor, what happens? So the mayor who's in office sometimes is allowed to finish their term in office. Sometimes it happens at the time that the mayor is leaving office. And then the selection method after that is some appointment process. There's kind of 2 main processes that happen, like 2 main kind of appointment styles that have happened, and sort of kind of depends on temporally where we are in the data. The current one that's sort of favored, like in Ulan-Ude, that there's a slate of candidates that is given to the city council by a special commission that's formed of members of the city council and the regional legislature. There have been times where there's kind of a city manager model where just this special commission just picks one and appoints them.
So, and in these cases where these reforms happen, to what degree they can be mapped to sort of preferences of the central government? Because your whole research here is about like whether this translates into the support for the regime, but this could be a completely independent process that is completely independent from the central regime, right? It could be this, well, the local council wants to control more executive power, and as a result of that, they decide to abolish the direct election of the mayor. This might have nothing to do with Putin or Moscow.
Yeah, so I get the question from Arturis here is like, is this really Moscow's doing, right? Or how often can we see Moscow's hand in it? Is it just sort of epiphenomenal or sort of idiosyncratic to the locality, or is this really sort of pressure from the center? It's clear that this is something that the Kremlin has wanted and has pushed this on regional governors, and regional governors have pushed on cities. Why it happens in specific places at specific times may in fact have something to do with some idiosyncrasies of the local place. I think more to the point when we get to the data, the question is sort of, if the dependent variable, the thing we're trying to explain is people's support for Putin, should they see this as sort of a machination of the regime or not? I guess the flip side of this is we're going to show you that even if it's not something that the center was pushing, people still are reacting negatively in a way that it appears they're associating with the center, even if maybe it was sort of a city council inspired initiative and it wasn't. And yeah.
And just to bring on that, because I was wondering the same thing. So it's never the case that the governor then appoints the mayor.
So
The city council maintains, so this
the
is.
city council is involved. It's a special commission that's a joint between regional officials and city officials.
And do you guys have any sense of whether that's just window dressing and it's really the regional
I mean,
administration controlling it?
So this is
what
where
I'm
we
trying to get at is, are these city councils like Arturos was saying, are these city councils trying to get more power, conceivably getting more power for themselves by doing this? Or are they actually just devolving power to the regional government?
So if you look anecdotally, I mean, it seems like people talk about this in the way that it is handing over more control to the center. So they don't talk about this as sort of, like, the city council is winning at the expense of the executive, like the local executive branch is losing relative to the local legislative branch. It is talked about in ways that sort of, this is one more step in the way that sort of our ability to control policy at the local level or control sort of local politics is being removed from us and handed to people up above who are sort of directly responsible to the Kremlin. That's the way that people talk about it. So there are cases where it might, this sort of story of kind of inter-branch conflict might be more reasonable. So like Yekaterinburg is a place where the relationship between this, well, that's not even a good example, because the relationship between the city and the region were pretty tense and conflictual. And so I think eventually when the region was able to sort of wrest control of this executive from an opposition-minded mayor to someone who's more pliable, but that's not sort of city level conflict here. There are cases when, I can think of at least 3 or 4 cases when mayors were removed for criminal activity, and they took that as sort of, this is the moment to transition to someone, we've got these bad apples, let's move to a system where we can sort of screen these people a little bit better. But that's, small handful of cases. It's not like, it's not most cases. So then I guess, anticipating this question that Arturos was asking, sort of like, to what extent does losing the ability to participate in these elections affect how people feel about the regime? So in some ways, maybe this is hand waving, Arturos, but whether or not it's actually Putin's doing, can we find some evidence that people are tying it to Putin? And so in the paper, we have some kind of theoretical sort of propositions about what we should expect to see. And it's essentially kind of summed up where these elections are working well, where we can see high demand for elections, then abolishing these mayoral elections should be associated with dissatisfaction, and people should be less satisfied with the regime, right? And that we can expect this to be stronger sort of in geographical places where elections were once where we had competitive elections, competitive electoral environments, or we see where elections are being perceived as being more meaningful, losing those elections is more painful for people. And then there are some people at the individual level who we might expect to be sort of more supportive of democracy, democratic values, and competitive elections. And we expect that to be those kind of people tend to be sort of younger voters or more educated voters. So our predictions in the paper that we're testing is just when we see elections being canceled, elections being removed, we should see a decrease for support of Putin in the city, and then among particular individuals, we should expect younger voters and educated voters to have a more negative response to that cancellation than those who are older and have less education. And then across geographic places, we should expect in regions to have a stronger history of sort of democratic practices, or in cities specifically to have this history of sort of competition, and we're going to measure that in terms of regular turnover among mayors. We should expect support to decrease more there. So we're testing these propositions using a bunch of surveys. So this is over 300 surveys, nearly 400 surveys these are large-scale public opinion surveys conducted by the 3 main opinion pollsters in Russia, Levada, Bitsom, and Foam. And so we have essentially every omnibus large-scale survey that they've done over the last 20 years, well, from period of 2003 to 2018. And we put these together in this patchwork. So it's not panel data, it's not the same respondents answering questions over time. And it's not even the case that sort of we have observations for every city in every month over the same, in every city over time. We have this kind of patchwork. So it's a little messy and a little ragged, but on the other hand, what we have is sort of a wide geographic coverage over a long period of time. And we're gonna sort of, and across all of them, they ask the question about people's support for Putin. So we can use the same explanatory, not the same explanatory variable, the same outcome variable across cities. We're going to take this survey data and then we're going to combine it with sort of precise date of cancellation. So we have these surveys are being conducted sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, but we know the dates that surveys are being asked, and we can also tie that to date of cancellation in these largest cities, gleaned from basically hand coding across these 200 cities, looking for the dates in which. Now we could talk in question and answer about how do we determine the date exactly, because there's some slippage there between when the proposal is on the table, when the first vote happens, when the city charter changes. There may be a range of different sort of ways to conceive of when people have actually lost the ability to participate. So we have this large survey data with dates on cancellation, and we are looking to explain people's support for Putin. And the explanatory variable we have on the right-hand side of this is sort of whether the city has an appointed governor or an elected governor. So it's a dummy for taking one if there's an appointed mayor. Sorry, I said governor and mayor. All right. I realize this may not be a place where we're going to get heavily into the methodology, but so we have here's our estimating equation, and we have clustered standard errors, fixed effects for city and year, month, and this is a staggered diff and diff. So for people who are unfamiliar with what we mean when we talk about difference and differences, so we can think of what we want to do is compare changes in support for Putin across groups. And we want to compare people who are living in cities that have just lost the ability to vote for mayors, the change of support before that reform and after that reform, against people who are living in other cities that have not yet lost that opportunity to vote for. So if we think of sort of here, this diagram is something I saw from other people who are displaying this, but so think of this baseline as sort of like someplace like Abakan or Anadir that hasn't lost the direct elections yet, or Ulan-Ude up until this week. So there's some sort of baseline that we can control, we can point to at various points and see pre and post some date, what does the change in Putin support look like? And we can compare that to cities in which at 1 month they had the ability to elect their mayor, reforms happened in the next month, that's taken away. Whatever change has happened, so you can think about this gap here, from where they were before to where they are now, how that compares to this other city where they were before and where they are now. And since this is staggered, these reforms are happening in different places, there's multiple comparisons to make. This has methodological challenges that we are aware of. And if we want to get into the weeds later on, talk about what we've done to deal with that.
So yeah, I know there's a lot of weeds around staggered diff and diff right now, so I'm not gonna get into that, but I want to ask a theoretical question.
Yeah.
When do you expect people, I mean, this is like a weird thing, like when do you expect people to actually get annoyed? Because I could imagine it actually, because a diff and diff, you need like a window around the transition period. Like we have a paper which is also trying to use staggered diff and diff, where we're looking at the effect of people being labeled a foreign agent on things and stuff like that. But that's really kind of clear, like the next time they have a video that comes out after they've been labeled a foreign agent. Whereas this, I could imagine you could go all the way back to like when they begin to first talk about it, that like people, then that's when they get angry because they're like, oh, the region is going to take away our thing, all the way up to not noticing it until when the next mayor is appointed. Yeah, and that could be a short period of time, but that could also be like a year and a half or a couple of years, right?
Yes, we have lots of conversations on this. And so conceptually, in collecting the data, what we tried to, so we read lots of news reports for each of these cities to try and get a sense of when does this enter the zeitgeist? Like when is this sort of, when is this the thing that people are talking about? And when is there some sort of can we detect some sort of public awareness and response to these things? And so if you know, when there's this moment of sort of resonance. So that's kind of a coding we've done for this. So okay, well, when does this show up on the radar? Alternatively, we've, you know, one baseline that's pretty clear across all cities is when does this change happen to the charter? We can get a date for that. And then, you know, sort of wider still, we can think of sort of like up until like some months afterwards. This may take a while for people to sort of happen. So we have basically different codings across the whole.
Did you try it with when the next mayor comes into power?
Yeah. So
Because that would seem like another time that people might notice. That,
Yeah.
oh, we have a new mayor. We didn't have an election for it.
I think the answer is no. We talked about it, but we'll look at it. So this is an R&R right now at AJPS, and so we have a list of things to do. We can add that to the
Yeah,
list.
it's
Pretty straightforward on it because we have. I mean, I think we have those data. So
And then the other question I was going to ask is how did you characterize zeitgeist, like that it entered the zeitgeist?
yeah, I mean, it's pretty squishy, right? So it basically was just pouring through news reports at the local level.
They use news media.
News media, sometimes public forum, like they have like these websites where people in the community are posting. And so we just look to see if we could find, because in some places like these things happen and there's almost no mention, right? That this is really kind of streamlined through, or we can't, at least from, go back in time and look back and from what we could tell from the record 8 years ago, this is not a thing people are.
I mean, if it's R&R at AJPS, don't worry about this. But
Yeah,
one thought would be for the if you wanted a more principled way to do that, for the second half of your data set, you could do something with social media.
Social media.
Yeah.
Imagine that coming from just talk.
Imagine that, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
But it could be more principled, right? Like when it gets above a certain number of thing, and then you really would have a kind of claim to zeitgeist because you a priori define what zeitgeist means. And
so one of the unfortunate things about our data set is that oftentimes these surveys are happening sort of sufficiently far apart that it kind of doesn't matter because the window between sort of, the time we have survey data for may have been like 3 or 4 months before the process happens. And the next time we have some sort of measurement for them is 3 or 4 months afterwards. So we can code more granular, but it turns out our survey data might not be granular enough to really to extract as much value from it. Because what we'd love to have is like, daily approval of Putin and then be able to sort of choose these sort of different.
But does that create a big problem if that window is very wide? Because in some sense, like what if, the quality of mayors that are elected is higher than the quality of mayors that are appointed. And by the time the measurement of the public opinion is a long time after the actual reform, right? You could sort of, what you could be picking up is the fact that, well, these mayors are kind of worse in quality, right? And therefore the central government, gets attributed blame for that in some way. So it's not really the losing the right to vote per se on the mayor, but it's just basically the administration becomes of lower quality.
Yeah, so
if this was around like a narrow window, I would see that as an effect of just losing the election.
Well, so I mean, so some of it is kind of like, how long would they have to be in office before sort of their low quality is sort of on display and people understand it? I mean, we're not sort of picking stuff like, that's 18 months after.
You're giving this talk in New York. It took about 2 months.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, I guess if in New York it's two months before people don't like Eric Adams, then so maybe that's a problem, right? And so then our results still mean something but it may be more about blame attribution as opposed to sort of anger about the elections themselves. All those two things are probably folded in together, right? If take away my ability to elect a mayor I like and give me a dope, right? It may sort of blame me for his dopiness, but I also probably tied up in that as we had someone better when I could pick them myself.
Sure, but then you would need to concede that you're not identifying the effect of losing election, right?
Yeah, or sort of we're picking up, it's bundled, right? Yeah, it's messier. Anton.
Could it also be about elite language, elites who are losing, what we expect to lose the ability to be elected? Like the current mayor who thinks that he or she is not going to be reelected and the new rules aren't there, so it's stirring stuff. People are.
So you're saying the people who were mayor, the elected mayor, that now the sort of sour grapes, like they've lost their ability to keep running for office, and so now they're sort of fomenting dissent among people. I mean, there are certainly cases where this is pretty fractious. Petrozavodsk is a place where like this was bad. But lots of times it actually is the case that the person who was the sitting mayor at the time of reforms continues on as the new mayor who is appointed, right? So maybe that's a way to deal with Arturos's concern here too, right? We could just try and isolate those cities where the identity of the mayor doesn't change at all, right? And so I don't know have enough of that to make statistical sort of power out of it, but that's certainly sort of the right strategy for your concern, I think. So just this, for those who are waiting patiently to get back to maybe substances as opposed to methods, let me just pause you for 1 more second. This kind of research strategy involves some assumptions that these groups aren't different before the reforms happen. And so we can test part of those assumptions and we don't find evidence that there are some meaningful differences. All right, so let's get to the results, right? So does removing these mayoral elections reduce regime support? And we see, in fact, yes. So looking in this first column, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the regression table, we're just going to look at this number right here. It's negative, and the value of it is an estimated 2% loss of support for Putin after elections are removed. The governors who are also sort of implicated in this process suffer a loss of support that's even larger in magnitude, about 5%. And then this last column, this is people in these surveys are also asked support for the government. So they're talking about the cabinet ministers like the Minister of Defense, Minister of Energy. These people are not implicated in this process, and we don't see that sort of public opinion about these folks moves in the same way that people who are more implicated, or maybe in Arturos's interpretation, people don't attribute blame to them in the way that they attribute blame to Putin and the mayor. So it's worth noting here that these are negative numbers, and we can detect a difference in the data, but they're not super huge, right? Like in fact, kind of modest. So there's some souring of public opinion, but it's not like support for Putin collapses in these cities. But we can look at the individual level. We have sort of these more kind of heterogeneity in terms of how people respond. And we see, in fact, younger supporters are really sort of turned off by this. That the support for Putin goes down by about 5 percentage points in cities that lose when elections are abolished. And interestingly enough, on the other end of the spectrum, there's some indication that perhaps there's some older voters who actually approve of these measures. They think no, and to the extent that sort of these are the folks who are in sort of prime age during the transition to out of communism and experience sort of the chaos of the 90s, they might be the exact kind of people that this sort of story of let's remove these sort of messy things. You've got the populists and people who are engaged in sort of self-aggrandizement. Let's just sort of remove these elections. These might be the people with whom that resonates most, right?
Or people who lived under communists.
Or people who lived under communists, right? They're sort of
Surprise.
Yeah. Josh, this is good. I'm getting great sense here.
New social media.
Interestingly enough, counter to our predictions, we don't see that this response it varies according to the level of education that people have. So it's not the case that sort of people with higher levels of education are more turned off by this. That seems to be pretty constant across levels of education. What about sort of geographical locations? Well, we see that if we look at regions that have histories of being sort of electorally competitive, and here electorally competitive is we're looking back at data from the 90s. So the graph, the plot here on the left is we'll call the effective number of candidates for governmental elections during the 90s. So we had vibrant electoral competition at the region level. The plot on the right is a more subjective level that's coded, subjective measure that's coded by experts about sort of just giving a score for regional competitiveness. In both these places, we see that the response to cancellation is more negative in cities that are in regions that once experienced sort of really vibrant kind of more vibrant electoral competition, and not so much in places that don't yet have a history of experiencing a lot of competitive contestations, right? And if we look, so that's at the region level. What that measure is at the region level, although our sort of events still at city level. If we look at cities, we can just see how long have mayors been in office. The last elected mayor in office, some mayors have been in for up to 20 years in office, and some have been in office only a year or two. And we can see that sort of in cities where the mayor has only been in their seat for a short period of time, these are cities in which respondents are sort of most aggrieved by losing elections. And in cities where their mayor has been the same mayor for a decade or more, the response to canceling elections is either sort of not very muted or potentially sort of even somewhat positive. Right? We just dichotomize this. Do you have a mayor that's been in their office for longer than 10 years or less than 10 years? Less than 10 years, the response is negative. More than 10 years, the response is positive to this. So the uptake, the takeaway from this is, that abolishing mayoral elections has had a negative impact on Putin's support, but it's a modest negative impact, right? But then also to recognize the the frustration and agreement, or so the negative response in Putin's support from abolishing elections does vary across groups of people, particularly younger voters and voters who have been in places where at one point in time, politics has been characterized by something that looks more competitive, and we've seen turnover occasions. So quickly in the last, I'd just like to share with you, what else do we know about has come along with removing these mayoral elections? Because my co-authors and I have done other research on this, and this might give us some insight into why people would be disappointed, or what the kind of negative consequences that might have come along with removing electoral results. So electoral elections. So mayoral elections. So first, it's worth noting that one thing that's happened is it's prompted a lot of efforts to get these elections back. So here's just a list of some of the cities, there's even more, but here's just a list of various legislative attempts or referenda that have been out there to try and get direct elections back for mayors. We've seen lots of them, and in fact, they've all failed except for two, and one of them was Ulan-Ude, that city that's just lost their elections, lost their ability today. This is the second time they've lost. They lost it in 2011, and they got it back in 2015, only to hear about 9 years later lose their ability to elect mayors directly again. So it's pretty rare that these would get back on the books, and half of them have lost it again. One of the other things that's happened is we see that sort of like Arturos was suggesting, maybe there's this blame attribution happening. Well, we actually have a study, John and I have a study looking at sort of some effects of blame attribution when these cities lose the ability to elect mayors and are stuck with appointed mayors. And in this, one of the things we see is at the local level, when things are going badly, when we see unemployment going up, that there's a sort of an effect where support for United Russia at the regional level, the people who are implicated in removing these elections and appointing the mayor, that they lose vote share in the next regional election. So as rising unemployment in the city, if you can't take it out on your own chief executive, then you take it out at the people the level of government above that had some participation in putting them there. So this might give some credence to your interpretation of this, right? That when there's some demonstration these people aren't doing a good job, that the centralization part of this leads them to attribute blame to specific actors. What about policy outcomes? In other work, John and I have looked at what this means for public service provision at the local level. What happens when we switch from a system where people could elect their mayor to now where mayors are appointed? And from survey data, this is from 2009, this is the Russian longitudinal monitoring survey. We have a battery of questions about people's perceptions of the quality of various kinds of public services. Some of them are specifically about apartments. So these apartments, housing stock, about 10 to 15% of housing stock in Russia is actually managed by the city level, the municipal level. So these are buildings where people own their own apartment, but nobody owns the building. And so the city de facto has sort of responsibility for them. And we can see whether we're talking about apartment conditions, whether we're talking about neighborhood conditions, the people who live in cities, at least in this survey, people who live in cities where they elect mayors have higher opinions about the quality of those conditions than people who live in cities with appointed mayors. Right? That there's at the perception level, at least we see indication that people don't think things are going as well in these cities that had appointed mayors as people did in cities with elected mayors. Similarly, when we look at Russia keeps track of the square meters of bad housing stock in the city. So these are things that are inspected by federal inspectors and deemed to be unsafe, so dilapidated or unsafe. And we see the stock of housing in cities that's categorized as dilapidated and unsafe increases after cities transition from having an elected mayor to an appointed mayor. And one of the question, why do we see this? Well, it's, you know, they've lost electoral, or at least our answer for this is they've lost electoral connection. They don't have to worry so much about what voters want in order to stay in their job. What they need to do is worry, in order to stay in my job, I have to do something that's gonna appease, you know, people higher up. And what is it that people higher up want in the Russian system? It's mobilized votes for United Russia. So if we look and see cities in which appointed mayors are doing a good job of mobilizing votes for United Russia, so high voter turnout, this is where we see the biggest increase in bad housing. So those places where they're doing the thing that their superiors want them to do, they can do a worse job of providing public goods. In places where they're not doing a very good job of mobilizing citizens, they have to do a better job of taking care of sort of public service provision. Right, so this is sort of the image that I have in my mind when I think about what's going on in Russia, is sort of erosion from below. And maybe this is sort of a starker version, but you know, it's this sort of this little cuts and erosion over time can have a big, you know, may have a cumulative impact on support for the regime or the stability of the regime. But let's not oversell, right? So we see this, I think what we're seeing today is there's evidence that these authoritarian leaders, or in our case, specifically Vladimir Putin, is, you know, has lost a little bit of support for being involved in this process that sort of abolishes elections. And that process is particularly grieving where those elections have been perceived, you know, there's reason to perceive these elections as having been sort of more useful or more competitive. But, you know, while this may sort of feed into the story of kind of the degradation of democracy under Putin is undermining his support, you know, let's put it in the right context, right? He's prosecuting an unjust war against a neighboring country, unprovoked, with whom they have strong historical ties. And that has not been enough to get people angry to depose him, right? So it's not like they're willing to stomach war in Ukraine, but they really want to vote for their mayor, and that's the thing that's going to sort of get him out of office, right? That's not what we're seeing. I think this is sort of one more straw on the camel's back, but I don't think it's not the straw that's probably going to break. But you know, I do think the research on authoritarian regimes suggests that these kind of grievances sort of persist, and you know, I guess we don't know if they accumulate or not, but that's my sort of my suggestion to you is I think that the people sort of, they keep a mental tally of what they don't like, and this is one of the things that I think is on people's mental tally, right? So ultimately, what does this mean for the regime? Well, I think, you know, for authoritarian regime more broadly, subverting elections is costly. It's costly in ways that sort of loses a little bit of support, creates overhead for them. They need to sort of manage things. And, you know, we may continue to see electoral authoritarian regimes because getting rid of elections sort of completely is not worth paying those costs. People demand them. At the same time, there are situations in which they're totally willing to do it because the benefit to them outweighs the cost, right? Lose 2%, 5% support, Putin can swallow that, right? Like if this gives him finer grained control, or he perceives it to be sort of in line with his, you know, his goals at the moment, even if it's unpopular, it's not unpopular enough to sort of be a deal breaker, and he can engage in this activity, right? So that's it for what I have prepared, and I'd love to hear more questions and comments from everybody.
So these are mayoral elections, and like Russia went back and forth with allowing and not allowing gubernatorial elections, right? Like I would presume the effects would be more pronounced given that those are sort of high level. Do we know anything?
So so Arturus here is referring to the fact that sort of once upon a time there was a period where Russians elected governors through a direct election period, and then they lost the ability to do that for 4 or 5 years, and then elections came back in some regions and not others. And so can we do the same sort of thing, investigate that time when in 2004 when they lost the ability to elect mayors? The problem, so yes and no, our data are really sparse at that period of time, unfortunately. So this would be, we'd love to do that more. So it's kind of a shock that happens to everyone all at once. And we have, I guess we should do it. I pushed my co-authors to say, hey, let's look at that. And I think their response has been, well, you know, we only have a handful of surveys kind of around this. It would be suggestive and interesting.
Yeah, but the effects would, I would presume, if anything more pronounced.
I would think so too, right? Like this, it was a deeply unpopular thing when it was announced, and it was like this sort of mayoral situation. It was a thing that people kept, when they, in the ways that they could, kept asking for it to come back. And it came back eventually, presumably because, it was popular and it stuck, it didn't cost the regime something that was too dear to bring it back. They brought it back in a form that was really watered down and not very competitive, right? So in order to get on the slate of candidates to run in any of these regions that allow for direct gubernatorial elections, these are slates of candidates that are approved by the regional legislature, which are dominated by United Russia. Antonio.
It's kind of a couple of related questions. So you've been talking about, and I think some of your hypotheses were phrased in from as do people value elections? Do you have anything in the surveys that sort of directly measures the value that people put on elections? Because it seems like in most cases you kind of imply that, well, in regions where they become more competitive, people should value them more. But is there a more sort of direct measure?
Yeah, so the most direct measure, I think these, where if we go back in the slide deck here, like there may be two more surveys that I didn't put on this slide here where this question was being asked. So this question doesn't get asked regularly on every survey. So, these 390 surveys we're looking at, right? They're happening in certain cities at a time period, in any given month. And this question is not on that sort of very regularly, right? Like 5 or 6 times over the span of the data. So we can't do it systematically. Seems like there's suggestive evidence here that this is the thing that people care about sort of broadly. We can't see, like when elections are abolished, now that you've lost them, does the proportion of people saying yes, direct elections are good go up? Like we don't have that ability.
And then a related thing, do you think people think about elections at different levels differently? Like would they be more, and I think that kind of related to what Arthur was asking, would they be even more angry about canceling it in federal level elections, hypothetically?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I wonder. So I think going back in time to 2004, I think losing the ability to elect governors was shocking and a little outrageous at the time. I think this is just my sense. At this moment, people would value their mayoral elections more than they would value those gubernatorial elections, because sort of the slate was so heavily managed at the governor level that I think people perceive this as to be sort of like, they're kind of indifferent. It doesn't matter who these people are, they're all going to be kind of the same, right? But that was not the case in many cities at the mayoral level. Federal level, I don't know. This is sort of like, this is maybe anybody's guess. I would imagine that most people knew exactly how this federal election was going to turn out, and that many people feel apathetic and indifferent about them, and that a large number of them turned out because they were forced to by their employers, who are being pressured by the government to turn out votes. And if in absence of that pressure, they probably would have just stayed home. I think that they didn't see that particular electoral procedure as being very meaningful. Even if they're Putin supporters, my guess is that there are plenty of them who think this is going to go along just fine without me. And they'd probably be happy to just let him keep doing what he's going to do. And the people who don't support him probably have very little faith that even if a majority of voters did not support Putin at the ballots, that's what the outcomes would demonstrate, right? So I suspect losing that ability right now would probably be shocking, but I don't know that people would sort of miss it as much as they would have 12 years ago. Dustin.
I have 2 questions. My first question pertains to the fact that on average, people tend to blame presidents for everything. Like every time hurricane hits the United States, it's the president's fault, right? So here, given your data, how can we differentiate between Russians blaming the regime versus Russians blaming Putin as a president?
Yeah, I mean, so in some ways, I think this comparison of, we detect an effect on support for Putin and the governor, but not other branches of government. That's maybe some steps in towards alleviating this concern. It's not just a bad thing happens, and so I blame state officials more broadly. Now, if you think it's really, no, it's about sort of the chief executive and these sort of exogenous shocks that are bad. My football team loses, or there's bad weather, or there's wildfires. It doesn't really have a lot to do with the chief executive, but sort of I'm angry, and ask me about him, and I'm less positive for him. There, I think it's still in this category of maybe what I answered Arturos before. It's a bad thing that happened, and they're tying it to Putin. This bad thing is political, so we still get some sort of measure about how they're unhappy with this thing, and they're tying it to Putin now. I guess before with him is sort of, is it really about the elections? And in your story, it is the elections. It may be of a different flavor, but of a similar sort of type as what we're talking about.
Thank you. And my second question is whether this, how do we actually define the thing as being a bad thing? Not necessarily a bad thing because it's stripping people of their electoral rights, but a bad thing because it's a change. Any sort of reform usually faces a backlash. And we actually see that with your when you account for age, for some people it is change, for younger people, for older people, this is no change, and no change is kind of perceived as a positive thing.
Yeah, I think of it as just sort of a conservative kind of anti-change sort of bias. Here, my guess is that age would flip, right? So I think younger people are more risk acceptant, and that sort of change is sort of, I think if there's a group of people who are open to change, it would probably be younger voters as opposed to older voters. So I don't think sort of this anti-change bias is what, at least that seems less consistent with this sort of plot.
We don't have any questions in line.
All right.
So
Well, thank you for your time, everyone. I really appreciate it.
thank you so much.